you really look at this 10 years and say, because we're adding carbon and methane emissions to the atmosphere so rapidly, and we know what their sources are, we've got to achieve this turnaround in this 10-year period. Is the most critical decade in the whole history of our civilization. And we're the ones who are alive during it.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to yet another Climate Emergency Forum. And we have again Guy Dauncey, and we're going to be discussing what is this translation to an ecological civilization and how do we get there? So Guy is a futurist and he works to develop a positive vision of a sustainable future, to translate that vision into action, not just words. He is a founder of the British Columbia Sustainable Energy Association and co-founder of the newly formed British Columbia Climate Emergency Network, and the author and co-author of 10 books, including The Climate Challenge, 101 Solutions to Global Warming, and Journey to the Future, A Better World is Possible. He lives on Vancouver Island in Canada. He's currently completing a new book on the economics of kindness, a 10-year transition to a green cooperative economy. So Guy, what is this transition and how do we do it?
Yeah, thanks, Regina. So if viewers have watched the previous episode of this, they'll learn that I'm taking for granted the absolute emergency of the climate crisis, the parallel absolute emergency of the biodiversity crisis, and the critical nature of this 10 years. If the temperature is allowed to rise by more than 1.5, 2 degrees, with every increment, the chance of stopping it rising to 3, 4, 5 degrees gets less and less and less. And if you study the science of when it gets to 3, 4 degrees, it is an absolutely disastrous future. You don't want to go there. The flip side of that is that if you implement the known climate solutions and the known ecological restoration solutions to protect biodiversity, you end up with a world that is plenteous, is rich in a non-monetary sense, is fabulous, is joyful, and it's a place you really want to live in. And then you really look at this 10 years and say, because we're adding carbon and methane emissions to the atmosphere so rapidly, and we know what their sources are, we've got to achieve this turnaround in this 10-year period. Is the most critical decade in the whole history of our civilization. And we're the ones who are alive during it. I mean, certainly people in 1940 might have felt it was totally critical. You've got to stop the Nazis. And they had that same total sense of urgency, certainly in Britain. And Roosevelt had it in America and he couldn't get, the other guys on till later. But when America came in, they shared that same sense of critical urgency, like everyone was in. When America joined World War II, after Pearl Harbor, which was, I think, December 1941, the motor industry needed to convert to making tanks and planes. They weren't told, please set up a study group and come back with this analysis, or let's do a trial, or, they were given 30 days to do the whole frigging transition. And they did it. I mean, the transition was easier than to making electric cars because it was a simpler mechanical technology, but everyone got on board with the urgent need to make the tools and equipment necessary to fight World War II and defeat the Nazis who were occupying the whole of Europe, apart from Britain. We need similar technological tools to retrofit every building so that it does not need to burn oil or gas, that it can use a heat pump or be a passive house design. We need similar tools to generate renewable energy, whether it's solar or wind or geothermal or small hydro or the electric storage batteries. We need similar changes to transform our city streets so that every street is friendly for cyclists with a separated bike lane. And all the other changes. We need all the restoration of our cities to bring urban farms, to bring tree planting, to restore nature and stuff like that. And during the Green Deal, during the New Deal, I should say, of the 1930s, when you had so many people miserably unemployed, miserably, wretched. Roosevelt brought in the Civilian Conservation Corps to create, tens of millions of jobs, doing everything all over the place, not only just, reforesting and restoring farmland, but also paying artists and musicians to get out into neighborhoods to sort of get people engaged with the arts. We need the similar kind of impetus so that all young people who are worried about the future and can't buy a house can get involved in building affordable housing that is passive house design, needs no external heat source apart from its own pure efficiency. The fact that you can build a house to passive house design that needs no external heat is something we need to register. The fact that you can have a house needing no external heat with LED lighting and stuff like that has its footprint ecologically in terms of energy needed is 1/10 of what it was in the old days. So you have this, people have talked about an energy descent as if it's going to make life worse for us all because you've got to lose energy. But the efficiency component of when you change to cycling from driving, you've got an energy descent of 99%. When you change from a regular car to an electric car, you've got an energy descent of 60 to 70%. And that electric car can be driven entirely by renewables. You're going to have efficient, there are buses running on electric power. There are heavy duty trucks running on electric power. There are pickup trucks fully electric where you can plug in your saw, plug in your tools and equipment so that the tradespeople love it because you've got all the equipment there with your toys in your truck. Trains all across Europe are already electric. You can make steel instead of by burning coal, by using green hydrogen generated by a surplus of renewable energy. This is a transition. And for those who say, oh, it's too difficult, too hard, I say, well, in the 1890s, everyone was riding horses and the streets were filling up with horse shit, flies, junk, chaos. If you watch a good period drama on PBS television or something, they'll show the streets full of horse shit. If you watch a bad one, the streets are all clean as if it never happened. Anyway, in 1890, we were all riding horses. By 1920, there wasn't a horse in sight. It was all cars and trucks. We did that transition in 30 years. It's just transition to a superior technology. This same transition to an electric future with electric cars, electric heat pumps, green hydrogen, it's an inevitable transition. Why would you want to not do an inevitable transition? And solar energy and wind energy are now the cheapest forms of new electricity available. When you talk to the coal miners, as Greta Thunberg did in Poland recently, and I believe a colleague on Joe Biden's team did recently in Oklahoma, or the coal miners are very happy to stop being coal miners if they're given a transition path to learn how to become solar installers, or green building retrofitters, or tree planters. They just want security to keep on paying their mortgage or their rent and feed their family. So one of the key messages is in our new climate emergency network in British Columbia, we got our messaging down to 4 simple things. Engage everyone now, all the young people, all the First Nations, the Black community, the immigrant community, the businesses, the labor unions, engage everyone now. Second is 100% transition to renewable energy by 2040 for all purposes, which means stop burning, no more expansion in fossil fuels, sign a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty left, right, and center. So you're not putting any money, freeze investments. Central banks would give instructions to banks, you're not allowed to lend money for fossil fuel investments. It's called credit guidance. The Chinese and the Japanese and the Koreans have been doing it for years, right? And the next one, that's the third one is leave no one behind. Don't have victims who are struggling because they can't pay the rent or they haven't got their income. And bring everyone with you. And the fourth one is protect nature now, which means the farms, the forests, the ecosystems. In those 4 categories, you can get everything that needs doing. And yet wrapped around it all is this 5th concept of a new economy that's emerging, which I don't talk about it openly so much because people feel confused about economics. But part of the 10-year transition will be giving every business the invitation to adopt a new business charter. And the new business charter says basically that your purpose as a business, as well as making a profit from whatever you're making or doing, is to serve your community, serve your workers, and serve nature, and restore and regenerate those. And the deal is that this is legislated, it's not a voluntary change. That after 10 years, if you do not move to this new charter, you either cannot operate as a business, or you cannot get any government contracts, You cannot get any government backup. You can't get any support in emergency. The central bank will never bail you out if you're a bank. So you apply the same thinking to banks, that every bank must change all its investment criteria to serve the community. Basically, you're changing from a dominator mind frame to a cooperator mind frame. That the purpose of business is not, in the 1920s, 30s, when a family started a business, they took a pleasure in what they're making in that business or what they're doing. They took pride in it. In the 1970s, when the neoclassical economics and neoliberal thinkers took over from Keynesianism, they actually said the only purpose of a business is to make money for the shareholders. It doesn't matter what you make. Keep the money people happy. And the chief financial officers took more importance than the chief engineers who knew what they were doing. And we saw, then the hedge funds will come in and buy them, and everything was just seen as a gambling market on Wall Street. All that has to change. Everyone knows it's crazy. It's feeding the massive inequality where CEOs are earning 900 times more per year than the lowest paid workers. Well, to put that in context, in the first 2 hours of a worker's day, in January the 1st, the CEOs earned the entire year's pay in that 2 hours of work. It's so egregiously wrong, and people know it's wrong. And that feeling of wrongness is what's driving the Trump regime in many ways, this sort of feeling that people feel it's unfair, they resent what's going on, and they don't know why it's going wrong, and they got completely befuddled because the Trump message was actually the message from the Koch brothers and the dominators that, get government out of the way, government's the problem. The reality is that domination is the problem. Domination by big monopolies, big corporations, and anyone who's trying to be a jerk in the economy and fool you around. So we changed the fundamental structure of all businesses to be social purpose businesses. We changed the structure of all banks to be social purpose banks. And when you look at the data, take the latest big financial crisis, 2008, 2009, the community-based banks had fewer losses and didn't need bailout compared to the big banks. We had the public dollar had to bail out the big banks. We had to give money to Wall Street because they said, oh, if we collapse, everything will collapse. So there's a whole other economy waiting to be expressed. And when people understand it, it's really exciting. There are people in every community. New York is full of people involved in what's called the social solidarity economy. It's the same in Ottawa, it's the same in Vancouver, same in Edmonton, same in Bogota, same in London, same in Berlin. People building cooperatives, starting sharing economy initiatives, starting urban farms, building new economic initiatives. They're what I call community wealth. So as we move to a new ecological civilization, instead of focusing on individual wealth, how much money is in the bank, focus on community wealth. Community wealth is the communities we live in that guarantee affordable housing, affordable daycare, childcare, great libraries, great public meeting spaces, affordable transportation or free public transportation, lots of nonprofits, lots of urban farms, lots of community. And if you're on a really low income, in a community with low or zero ecological community wealth, you're really struggling. You're alone, you're on your own, you can't afford the rent, you can't afford to get anywhere, but if you're on the same low income in a community with high community wealth, you've got guaranteed affordable housing, you've got affordable transportation, you've got affordable childcare, you've got guaranteed jobs, you've got nonprofits wanting to engage you, you've got communities where people are meeting with their neighbors and talking to each other. So you've got a richness of personal wealth and no more loneliness. It's a way better place to be. And your money goes a whole lot further. So you don't feel poor anymore. You can manage on a lower income, which means also living simply. You're not consuming so much stuff. You're getting your inner reward system from the wealth of community and people and purposeful work and doing stuff meaningfully instead of just from getting money. I remember when I had a job I didn't like much in my youth as a milkman for a while. It was okay. I was driving an electric vehicle, believe it or not. But once a week, I'd go and buy something purely to prove that I wasn't just giving my money to the man. And I had to consume something, so I got something for me. When you're doing meaningful work, you never have that experience. I never need to go out and consume something to prove that I'm a worthy person, because every work I'm doing is meaningful. Everyone should have the right to meaningful work that contributes in a positive, purposeful way to the community and have good enough pay to live in a simple way to do that. And so when you put this stuff together, it becomes, I think, a really exciting look at this organized transition, but it needs political will, political organizing. In a democracy, you need a majority on every council, on the city council, on any board of directors for a school, on the state representation level. You've got to fight for every single vote in a fair voting system to get those people elected to positions of leadership, because then they can make that a law. They can actually bring in legislation that says in 10 years, every company must be a social purpose company. It becomes legislation and not a voluntary thing. There's so much to talk about here. There's such an exciting bunch of changes that are happening. Those engaged know about this already.
Thank you, Guy. We're talking about, and we're talking with Guy Dauncey about rapidly bringing in the imperative of the kindness economy. And in the first session, Guy talked about the fact that it's fairly natural for us to be kind and move and live towards kindness. Guy, I was very interested. I wondered about this. I was very interested to hear you saying that government would actually take a very big role in enabling this switch to kindness economy with legislation and a whole list of things that you said that governments had to do, which their responsibility to do, which would transition, as you say, to this form of economy, a form of economy which is rational, which isn't perverse to the environment and society, which would be a huge change. Could you talk about where subsidies and taxation comes into this formula?
Yeah, so firstly, the economics of kindness is based on the cooperative principle, that when we cooperate together, we generally feel more free to be kind to each other because we feel secure and not threatened. The more threatened you feel, the more you put up barriers and you're less free. So under a dominator system, when you have dominating business and dominating rulers, there's not much kindness ever came out of the White House during Trump's 4 years, put it that way. Right now, there's kindness pouring out of the White House because Biden follows a different agenda. The fundamental economy of the economics of kindness is a market economy. The market is a fundamentally cooperative thing. We should not undermine the market. We should not destroy the market. We need to keep the market. But we need to govern the market through with a cooperative mindset. Every market's like a soccer playing field or a football playing field. There are rules. The sports teams compete by agreed rules. And so the term deregulation is just spin for change the regulations to suit the big corporations. Get them off our backs, let us do more damage, basically. And so we need regulations to frame the market economy in a way that is fair to everyone. Taxes are an essential reciprocal return. They're basically, if you, on a family level, have a relative who's really suffering or in hospital, and you all chip in to help out, on a big level, that's what taxes do. The government says, there are things we need collectively, like an agreement to drive on one side of the road, like public education, like a decent healthcare system, like schools, like crime prevention. We say, yeah, we need those things. But they're better off done by a single source than having private police forces. And you've got to pay to your private police force. That's called the mafia or the gangs. That is a private police force who will protect your business if you pay them, and they'll crunch your knees if you don't. So better off have a fair, objective, democratically controlled police force that is trained not to engage in systemic racism and all that other stuff. And so taxes do that. And when taxes are done fairly, people have no problem paying them. There was a period in British Columbia 20 years ago when there was a bit of anti-tax fever going, whipped up by a taxpayer association who claimed the right not to pay taxes. And the paper in Vancouver ran a question, said, how many of you like paying taxes? And they had so many responses, they filled 2 entire center pages with the reasons why people like paying taxes. Okay. Because of this, that, and the other. But on top of that, there has to be taxation on inheritances and wealth, I believe, because they're the prime way that inequality gets passed on. The fact that the billionaires have so increased their billions during the pandemic, while other people are facing eviction, is inherently and morally and ethically wrong. So taxation, subsidies are relevant when the government wants to support an incoming technology. The government investment created Google and the internet. It wasn't private corporations, it was government investment through subsidies at early stage. So the government's got a key role to play in all this, but I'll pass it back to you, Peter.
Okay, so clearly, immediately, we're going to have government, or we're going to compel government to terminate the fossil fuel subsidies. right? Obviously.
Well, yes, absolutely. That is, I mean, the idea of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty is the governments would sign that treaty and that they would cease providing all support to any new fossil fuel developments. And they'd wind down the fossil fuel subsidies, which seem to be they're so entrenched in very difficult details of stuff. But I just believe it's fundamentally that there's so much influence by the fossil fuel industries and lobbying governments when it comes to sort of, behind the scenes stuff. So clear lobbying standards that every elected official keeps a diary of all lobbying. And there's a formula, for every one fossil fuel company you meet, you've got to spend equal time with a nonprofit campaigning to sort of deal with the climate emergency. So it's transparent and clear and not all behind the scenes.
Okay.
But yeah, that kind of stuff.
And then also, just to finish off with, clearly we're going to tax pollution, but clearly we're going to have governments, compel governments to full cost tax the incredible pollution, particularly that's coming out of the fossil fuel industry, right?
Well, tobacco is a great example. We have been taxing tobacco for 30, 40 years now with great success. It makes it, you tax the bad and you then pour money into public education to stop smoking. In Canada, we have a carbon tax. It is it started in British Columbia. It's now up to $50 a ton. It needs to, under our Canadian government rules, it would increase steadily until it reaches around $190 a ton. Here's the thing, though, in a resistant political situation where people are complaining and groaning and moaning, you give 100% of the income back to people as an annual check in the mail every January. So as much as they pay in carbon tax, it's shared out among everyone. There's some distributive economics, but you get a check back. So if you choose to have an electric car and a heat pump and cut your emissions to zero, you still get the check back. And that makes it completely fair. If you have a population who are really mobilized by the climate emergency and say, look, no, don't give me that money back, invest that money in whatever's needed, then you can do that. But for political reasons, you give it back if you need to get Republicans or conservatives on board.
Yeah.
It's a very simple, clear tool that works.
Yeah. Thanks, Guy.
So, I'm still, I have further questions to follow up from the previous video about the transition period. And, you've acknowledged that there'll be a lot of pain to go along, like until we actually do a transition, there's going to be a lot of steps backwards, steps forward, and so on. And, I think it was pretty clear that, I had an interesting trip through Northern Ontario. My son he joined a company to replant trees, and that's considered an essential service. So I was able to travel with him and his friend. And I made a number of different stops along the way to various cities, which are kind of a microcosm for the climate emergency, what we could end up heading to, and also the virus. So I stopped at Elliott Lake, and if you're Canadian, you've probably heard of Elliott Lake. It used to be the uranium capital of the world. So it's a beautiful town in the middle of the forests and lakes. But behind that beauty, there was a horror of radioactivity. So at one point, it mined about a quarter of the world's supply of uranium. And the mine tailings were then used in foundations to build houses and et cetera. And of course, there's a lot of radon gas in uranium ore. And, then they had tremendous health problems in the town. Hundreds and hundreds of miners died, excruciatingly painful deaths from lung cancers and things. And through economic reasons, the uranium mining ended, and the town's now a retirement community. And most of the horror is hidden. If you drive through the small town, it's very hard to find even the memorials for the miners that died, and there were many of them. And then I went to Sudbury, which is, everything is exposed there and visible. So, a huge nickel mining town. When you mine nickel and smelt it, you get a lot of sulfur, and the sulfur went up, and it basically turned every rock in Sudbury black. It killed all of the trees, all of the vegetation, caused enormous health problems. Then they built, their solution was to build a super stack. They call it the Inco super stack, smokestack. And it pushed all the pollution up and released it about 1,000 feet above the ground, where it would then spread across Ontario and even down to the US. And of course, that was a big source of the acid, sulfur dioxide for acid rain pollution. And then driving across Northern Ontario, motels have closed and small businesses have closed. And it looks like they've been bombed or burned out. You're driving along the highway and you see what used to be a motel just a year ago. And it was closed down because of the lack of business from the coronavirus. Then it was destroyed by vandals and it was set on fire. Then it was fenced off. In, time and time again along the road, these beautiful areas along the highway have turned into sort of like war zones, these individual areas. So, so I think, I guess the concern is, it's really difficult. We're on a path to global famine, okay, with the loss of the Arctic sea ice and the jet streams waviness, getting more and more extreme weather events. So we're on a path probably within about a decade of having global food shortages and a global famine. So I guess the point is I don't think countries have much time to try to change their behavior towards climate change. I think, this scenario is going to be thrust on us, whether or not we like it. So how can we, how can we convey that risk to people, so that we can transition to this different ecological future?
My goodness, Paul, you've got about 10 things tucked away in there. But I could, if it was 1941, I could give you a tour through Europe where the Nazis had occupied everywhere, and people in occupied France, nobody spoke to each other. They kept their heads down. They were starving. They felt fear. Tanks were everywhere. People felt completely hopeless. General de Gaulle had not yet organized a Free French army. And then people did mobilize. So the town of Sudbury, to take one example, was an absolute blackout with pollution before they built the big smokestack. So locally, they invested in a massive tree planting operation. To eliminate the big smokestack, you would change your smelting to green hydrogen instead of burning coal and stuff like that. The town of Elliott Lake, when it was closed down from being a uranium city, they said, what are we going to do here in the middle of nowhere? And they had a community meeting and they repurposed themselves as a retirement place because they said, we're really safe. There's no crime here and it's beautiful and peaceful. The small communities in Canada, there's a show on Canadian TV, CTV, called Still Standing, when a comedian goes to small communities that have really struggled. And he shows how they pulled together. When you don't pull together, you get entropy. And everything just falls apart and you allow that motel just to collapse. When the community pulls together, you get syntropy. And so you need a government program that I call CPR, Cooperative Public Renewal, which actually enables a small town to actually invest in the training needed to pull people together, to set up a community economic development corporation, to start new businesses, to ask people, what's our purpose? How do we help each other? And pull together as a community. I know there are people told me they're driving around America, they go to some areas where it just feels desolately abysmal, like nobody's caring anything about themselves. But the contrast between, that's a community with very low community wealth. Community with high community wealth is pulling together where people self-organize to overcome those challenges and change their economy for whatever it is. We're going to need to do that wherever a community is struggling. In terms of food, 90% of the farmland is used to grow grain for beef and meat. I've been vegetarian for over 50 years. I'm now 73. I have no illnesses, just a heart fibrillation. I'm strong and healthy. There's phenomenal capacity for food growing if we just eat less meat. And so I don't need, there'll be periodic famines. There's famine in Yemen right now. There's been famines, periodically. But our ability to work as a world together is being, this is the biggest thing that's happening under COVID. We're realizing finally, if we let COVID get out of control in India, it's going to breed fatal variants, which are going to come and infect us all. It's forcing us to think together as one planet and we apply that same thinking to military expenditures, to fossil fuel issues, and work together as a planet, we don't need to have famine at all. Every farmer wants to grow food because they get their income from it. They're motivated to grow food because that's their income. And the more we eat less meat, the more here in Vancouver, and all the young people, mostly young women in their 20s, want to run a farm, not to raise meat, to grow vegetables and fruits and berries. But they just can't get the land. So you need government engagement to do that. But I can take your same travel journey of woe and turn it into a travel journey of determination and hope. So you can look at things through different lenses, right?
Yeah, thanks.
I like that. I like that you spoke, Guy, about the different lenses. In a way, you kind of remind me of Joanna Macy, because she's able to see what's going on and with the environmental collapses, if you will, that we're seeing, and be able to see them from very hopeful eyes, which I must say I struggle with. And it also brings to mind, you speak of GDP, which I really appreciate it. But also it brings to mind Bhutan. They measure their gross domestic happiness. And I think these visions are beautiful. And I love your ideas and your vision and your thoughts of how we can redo the world. But I have to say that in hearing some of it, I'll be honest, from many, many American perspectives, you are their worst nightmare. You are their worst nightmare, because happy people, as you just said, don't buy things. If people don't buy things, what happens to our economy, which in some ways seems to be like built on a Ponzi scheme? This whole thing of like, okay, we will give government subsidies to these businesses who agree to these green principles. I know a lot of Republicans in this country would say that that's government overreach, that's socialism, that's fascism. No one really knows what these words means here. They just throw them around. And I'm wondering if you've thought about how your positive thoughts are frightening to so many people.
Absolutely. But you mentioned, when I mentioned GDP, when I mentioned GDP, it meant gross depletion of the planet, just to put that in context. The economy I'm talking about is a market economy with businesses. If you go back to 1821, the average working week was 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. 10-year-olds working. Because of pressure by workers and then later by unions, they got that down to a 12-hour day. They then campaigned in 1848 for an 8-hour working day. And the unions have been insistent that, you get paid overtime, you do more than 8-hour working day. When we stop wanting more and more stuff all the time and want more quality in our lives and more friendship and community and family, and buy less stuff, we could have less stuff being made and work fewer hours. So we're looking towards a 4-day week for everyone, a 30-day week. And then you've got a 3-day weekend. You've got now time with your family. You're spending money on different things. You're spending it on travel, on picnics, on sports, on arts, on stuff you're doing in your 3-day weekend. But we need that for everyone. And for Republicans who are listening, the values I'm talking about in economics of kindness are values of family. They're of community. They're of caring for each other. They're of principles around the need to behave decently to each other and not allow corporate elites and plutocrats to manipulate and abuse us. They're about equal justice for everyone, Blacks and immigrants and Latinos and whites and indigenous people. They're about equal justice for women and children. So it's actually a beautiful world. And it's nothing, I think, threatening to core Republican values and core Democratic values. It's a change of thinking, that's all. It's nothing scary around this at all. It's beautiful.
I think I agree with you. I do think it's beautiful. One of the huge challenges that I see going into the future, and perhaps this could be another discussion at another time, is the role of social media in shaping people's thoughts and ideas. And so often people think that their thoughts and ideas are their own, when in fact, they are manufactured to the benefit of industry. And that's something.
That's always been true. It used to be called pub talk. People would go down to the pubs in the evening in the 1800s or 1700s, and they'd learn their ideas from what their friends were saying. and they'd learn to call someone the N-word and repeat it because that's what they thought they were doing. There was fake, as much fake news in the past as there was. What's happened with social media is a massive accelerant, plus isolation in our own homes, so people have got all day long to go down the rabbit holes. When the first print media came out, it had no regulations against slander, no regulations against libel. And because the abuses of the media in the 1800s, there was legislation brought in. We need legislation to control the social media. Facebook is trying to do it internally with their public auditing panel, the one that just said to Trump, no, you can't, you've got to stay off the thing. We need public regulation of the social media companies, not necessarily by government, by an appointed panel, to stop the spread of lies and myths and nonsense, because it very quickly turns into crazy nonsense. Because you might say, oh, the bankers are all terrible. And then suddenly you're saying the Jewish bankers are all terrible. And then you're down a terrible rabbit hole and you're denying the Holocaust. It's very dangerous to let people's brains go crazy on this stuff without a balancing principle. It's a major struggle. You cannot have a free democracy without a fair media, a fair press. And that includes the social media now. And so there's some big new thinking going on around that. So, the book Surveillance Capitalism deals with some of it all. So we can't afford to allow social media to be a free-go zone when the crazies and the Holocaust deniers have as much space as those who've, got 3 university degrees and really done their homework.
Thank you so much, Guy. I really hope that people are listening and we can enact this legislation and these rules. And I just want to say briefly that your announcement about your age and how long you've been a vegetarian, if there's no ad or anything that will convince you to be vegetarian, take a look at Guy and hey, consider going vegetarian. I will say for myself, I've been vegetarian for over 25 years. I'm not so sure if I'm as good a poster child as he is, but just think about it for yourself and the planet. And I want to thank you all for joining us for yet another Climate Emergency Forum. This has been a very enlightening and enjoyable discussion for me. And if it has been for you, please like and subscribe. Share the video with your friends. And if you have other thoughts about what topics you'd like to see in the future, please share them in the discussion. And we'll also share information with you about the book that Guy described and links to other important information. So once again, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Climate Emergency Forum. Thank you, everyone.